I want to ask you, do you really believe I pointed a gun at 2 or 3 cops without a single shot being fired, a young black man? And
Rapper Meek Mill was on CNN's Smirconish and gave a truly powerful reality check to both the host and viewers. Now, before I get to these 2 clips here, I have to set it up. So, Meek Mill has now become a criminal justice reform advocate. So he recently put out this op-ed in the New York Times. Meek Mill, prisoners need a new set of rights. Like many who are now incarcerated, I was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. I got lucky, but because of dysfunctional, discriminatory rules, most don't. So, if you don't know the backstory here, Meek Mill was arrested and sentenced to 2 to 4 years for popping a wheelie. Now, it was technically, the way they handed this out, it was technically breaking his probation, but it wasn't really, because they were able to fight it and actually get him out on bail after 5 months, thanks to how high profile the case was and the fact that it was ridiculous to begin with. Now, let me get to this first clip here where, Meek Mill just starts the conversation.
I have to play devil's advocate and ask Meek Mill this. You wrote that piece for the New York Times, and not only did I read what you wrote and watch the video, but I also read the comments that were appended to it. Many of them were supportive, but many of them, Meek said, hey, you're not the right guy to take on this fight. I can put one on the screen of just something that was typical. I'm not defending our criminal justice system at all, but let's look at the facts. It was more than just a wheelie. We don't know his juvenile record. He got probation, on and on and on, got convicted for selling drugs, possessing a firearm. Essentially, it makes the argument you didn't play by the rules. And if you had played by the rules, I'm going to give you the chance, but if you hadn't played by the rules, you wouldn't have had issues with the system.
I always dreamed too of being like on like CNN and being able to express myself and speak for like the voiceless young men of America. The first step I would say, I grew up in America in a ruthless neighborhood where we're not protected by police. We grew up with people selling drugs on our neighborhood, on our front steps. We grew up in ruthless environments. We grew up around murder. You see murder 7 days a week. I think if you grew up in my neighborhood, you see 7 people die a week, I think you would probably carry a gun yourself. Would you?
Yeah, I probably would.
Yeah, yes. If you seen your neighbors and family members, or you seen one of your best friends you grew up with get your brains blown out, I think you would want to protect yourself. Second of all, my first juvenile arrest, going to school, being suspended, I didn't want to tell my mother that I was suspended from school because my mom would have to take off from work. She was a single parent, and my father was in the graveyard. So, I was afraid to tell my mom I was suspended. I went to school on a suspended day. That was my first arrest as a juvenile for being in school. I guess the charge was trespassing.
All right, there's a few things I want to break down here before we get to the next clip. So this commenter on this article that Smirconish read, they make the assumption that I think a lot of people make, and they assume that's assuming guilt of the person who is found guilty while completely ignoring the context. So Meek Mill discussed there, and this is true for a lot of people in America, he was born into this society, this community, where selling drugs was normal. That was a normal career path for people in that community because there is oftentimes a lack of opportunity, even the lack of a visibility of opportunities. A lot of these communities, the kids growing up in them, they look up to the drug dealers because this is a way for them to get out, to make money, to make a living for themselves. So if you don't have that context, if you're somebody like me who was born into a community that's very safe, that there wasn't people selling drugs outside of my house, then it can be hard to understand that. But if you put your mind into the life, the family of somebody who is living in a community like this, you can understand how easy it could be to fall into that life, which also goes to the next point that commenter made and saying that, Meek Mill was arrested for carrying a gun. Now, again, these arrests have to do, are far in his past. So the probation he was serving had to do with those arrests. But again, carrying a gun, like he asked Smirconish there, if you see somebody die or get murdered every day in your community, would you carry a gun? And Smirconish even has to admit that, yeah, I probably would. because this is the reality that Meek Mill lived in. It's the reality that a lot of people live in. People whose stories that we don't get to hear because they aren't famous. So all I'm saying is that this is not to excuse people breaking the law, but it's to understand that context and understand that the issue here isn't that they're breaking the law. The issue is the community that they are living in, because that's what fosters it. So to actually fix this problem, you have to invest into these communities and offer real opportunities and actual help to get these families, these children, out of that situation. Now, the other assumption that I'm not sure if this commenter makes, but a lot of people make, and that's just that the system in general works, which, I mean, it's so absurd if you actually look at the data. So the US has 5% of the world's population, yet 21% of its prisoners. And of course, tops the list worldwide at 665 per 100,000 people. Now, the number looks even more stark when you compare it to OECD countries, which is a collection of 34 industrialized nations. So that 665 just looks completely absurd next to, I mean, every other country here: Turkey, Israel, Chile, New Zealand, Czech Republic. I mean, you go down the list. No one is even close in terms of OECD countries to the US in their incarceration rate. And on top of that, the recidivism rate in the US is 65%, meaning more than half of people that go to jail go back to jail. And more than half of those that go back to jail are back in jail because of technical violations on their probation or their parole. So again, oftentimes these are not people that are actually committing more heinous crimes. These are simply something like popping a wheelie and having that send them back to jail. Now, the other part that Meek Mill mentioned there that is, I mean, maybe the most powerful aspect of that entire clip was how he talked about the first time he was arrested as a juvenile, it's because he went to school while he was suspended. I have never heard of this. Is this normal? I mean, to send a kid to jail for the first time, or to arrest somebody for the first time because they went to school while suspended, I just don't even understand that. And the reason he did that is because he was afraid of telling his mom, because his mom would have had to stay at home, or would have had to stay home. She was a single mother. So this is the context that a lot of people lack, because their lives were nothing like this. They did not grow up in a community like this. They did not have people selling drugs on their street. They did not have to worry about carrying a gun because they saw murder every day. This is just not what a lot of people experience. So if you are critical of someone like Meek Mill, just for a second, put yourself in someone else's shoes and imagine growing up in a community like that. You would not be the same person you are today. So the environment you grow up in, the zip code you are born into, is the biggest factor in terms of predicting how you are going to be, how successful you're going to be in life. So if you are born into a wealthy community, there is a good chance that you are going to live a very happy, wealthy life. If you are born into a very poor community, there is a very good chance that you are going to remain poor. These are just the facts. So to understand how to actually get to the root issue, you have to deal with these sorts of, over these communities, and actually investing into these communities that have been left behind. Now, let me get to the next clip here, which gets even more lively.
And at 18 years old, I was arrested by the narcotic strike force, which most of these guys were federally investigated. Most of these guys were found out to be liars. They lied on the stand and was proven to be liars. I was arrested for pointing a gun at a whole strike force. You know what a strike force? A strike is when 5 or 6 cops come to do a bust. I was arrested for pointing a gun at 2 or 3 cops without any shots being fired. And this is for America. Now we have like cameras and hand cameras. I want to ask you, do you really believe I pointed a gun at 2 or 3 cops without a single shot being fired? A young black man? And
I don't know what the underlying facts are. I just don't want to ignore the argument that some make that, hey, Meek Mill's not the guy who should be making this case.
I just want to explain it. I just want to know from a personal opinion, do you believe a young black man in America can point a gun at 2 or 3 cops, because I'm not the only one that get found guilty for these things. Cops charge people with these things at an alarming rate, and people take deals because they don't have lawyer money or they can't afford attorneys to even fight for their freedom. Do you believe that a young black man can lift up a firearm and point a gun at 2, 3 cops while they're attempting to do a bust with their firearms out and not a single shot being fired? That don't even make sense in America. And I never really spoke on that because I never valued myself growing up in a ruthless environment. I seen that happen to many kids, so it was just normal to me. And as I grew up, I always felt embarrassed being around like my Caucasian friends. And I used to always say, like, do you believe I pointed a gun at a cop? Where I come from, like, I'm on a successful path. I got sense. Pointing a gun at a police officer is suicide for a black young man. I never thought about committing suicide in my life, so that's almost like disrespect to me. And I was accused by another black cop, which things I speak on my album Championship, where I talk about self-hate. So I don't know how people could say that they don't think I should be the face of it. I was wrongly accused. I was sent to jail multiple times for not even committing crime. I've been sent to jail at least 2 or 3 times just for being addicted to Percocets and never sent to rehab. I was sent to jail for popping a woolly. If you follow me on Instagram, which many of these kids in America do, I've been popping woolies on my Instagram across America for the last 10 years, and I never was arrested. The farthest it ever went was a traffic ticket. And my whole message to get across is, if somebody like myself who's doing so good for myself, I'm not involved in crime, I've been working, I employ people, I pay taxes, if probation can stalk me down and bring me back to a state penitentiary without committing crime, what could it do to these other kids that are trapped in these environments surrounded by crime and violence? They don't stand a chance. You have thousands of kids that will be destined to be put in prison for the rest of their life. Their beds are already made up.
All right, so there's a lot I want to talk about here because we really need to drive these facts home. So the last thing that Meek Mill discussed there, how the bed is already made for a lot of these kids, it's true. Just, again, think about it. If you are born into a community where it is full of crime, it lacks opportunity, and oftentimes the only way to feel safe and have opportunity or have money is to get involved in that crime. This is just the reality for a lot of people. Now, you may think, on your in your happy community, oh, I would never do that. I would never turn to crime. You are not put in that situation. It's a much different experience when you are actually growing up in that environment. As I said, your zip code determines your success in life. If you are born into a wealthy community, you start on a fantastic path. If you are born into a crappy community full of crime, then you are likely to get into that life. So all you have to do is use some common sense. And also extend that common sense to what Meek Mill was talking about in terms of him pointing a gun at cops and getting arrested for that. If he actually pointed a gun at a bunch of cops, would he be alive today? No. I mean, there is 99.9% chance that he would have been shot and killed. That's what often happens. Oftentimes, black people are shot without having a gun at all. So this is somebody who was arrested for actually pointing a gun at cops with no shots being fired. If that actually happened, he would have been shot and likely killed. So again, people have this assumption that the cops are always going to do the right thing. That's just not true. We see it again and again and again. There are many people, largely black men, that are incorrectly or wrongly convicted of crime. This happens all the time. Now, the other, some other points he made here, he made a lot of good points, but so he talked about how a lot of young black and Latino men can't afford a lawyer, which means they take deals. So if they're convicted of something and they don't have anyone that can properly fight for them, then the easiest way out is to take the deal, meaning they admit to doing a crime they never did, have to go to jail, but at a reduced sentence if they had to, instead of them fighting the charge and losing and being in prison for even longer, they just accept the fact that they have no opportunity, they have no chance. So it's better for them to actually take a deal even if they didn't commit the crime. This happens, again, all the time. Now, Meek Mill should beyond all the time, because he made a lot of good points here. He was sent to jail for addiction. Multiple times he was sent to jail because he was addicted to pills. This, again, shows you how broken this system is. So if you look at Portugal, I think 15 years ago now, decriminalized all drugs because their situation is they had the highest rates of addiction in Europe. They decriminalized all drugs, put that money into healthcare and prevention, and now 15 years later, they have the lowest rate of drug addiction because they took the crime element out of it and actually treated addiction as it is, a health issue. That's how you deal with addiction. Throwing people in jail does not solve anything, and it makes the problem worse. Now, the last point I want to touch on here that Meek Mill discussed is this misconception that if you're black, you can't be racist. So if you're a black cop, then you can't possibly be racist against black people because you're black. Complete bullshit. So let me give you some facts here. Josh Carell, a psychology professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, tested these biases through a video game simulation in which people were tasked with quickly identifying whether virtual suspects possessed a weapon and should, as a result, be shot. The results: subjects of all races were quicker to shoot black suspects compared with white ones. Carell explained to Janae Desmond Harris for Vox, "We think this represents an awareness of a cultural stereotype. Not that our participants believe necessarily that black men are more dangerous than white men, but by virtue of the movies they watch, music they listen to, etc. They're getting the idea that black male goes with violent. The group and the idea are linked together in their minds, whether they agree with that stereotype or not. It's also possible that being a police officer and integrating into the culture of the job could make a cop, even a black one, racist." Adam Waits, a social psychologist at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, pointed to the concept of de-individuation, which says that people lose their sense of self-awareness while in groups. This changes the self-identity of all police officers regardless of race. So black cops may think of themselves as members of the police department rather than members of a certain race while on duty, making it easier for them to act in ways that discriminate against members of their own race. So again, this goes to something like groupthink. If you are in a certain group and that is the mentality, the mindset that that group has, you carry that as well. It permeates throughout all members of that group. So we see this in, whether it's in Washington or in the media, where they have this idea of, oh, what's wrong with taking corporate money? No, you have to do that. That's totally normal. It doesn't mean it corrupts you. Again, this is groupthink. Anybody outside of those institutions can understand, of course, even if it's subconscious, if you are taking money from a certain organization, that is absolutely going to affect how you vote on policy. So this is just groupthink. It doesn't matter if you're black or white or whatever race. If you are on duty as a cop, you take on the mindset of whatever that environment that you're in has. So if the environment that you're in disproportionately goes after black people and tries to look for crimes that they're committing, or disproportionately stops black drivers, then you as well will do that. And sometimes I've seen other stories saying even more so, that black cops will even go after black people even more, sort of as a way to try and prove themselves and say, look, oh, I'm a better black person. I'm a good black person. I'm going to prove myself to these other officers and show them that I'm not like them. I'm different. So they go after black people even more. Now, I think I've done enough talking here. I'm going to link to that Vox article so you can read more about that. And also I'm going to link to Meek Mill's op-ed in the New York Times below my video. It's well worth the read. And also link to his website, reformnow.com, which has to deal with his initiative that he's working on with criminal justice reform. So again, this was a fantastic appearance by Meek Mill on CNN, and I hope we see more from him on cable news.